Okay, in this today we have been much focusing on the near future, which is actually also the present. So for the two last segments of this conference, we're going to look further ahead in the real future and implications for journalism even further ahead. And I am so happy to invite to you here on stage Agnes Stenbom, who is a host today, an organizer, and if she is not known to all of you before, she will be it now, I think. She is Ph.D. in AI journalism and head of the Schibsted INLab. And I thought that the INLab of Schibsted means the innovation lab of Schibsted, but actually it means the inclusion lab of Schibsted, and that might be a key. Please.
Thank you so much. We're almost through, and you're going to be so sick of my voice after those 2 days. But I wanted to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the work that we do at INLab, yes, short for Inclusion Lab. And I'm doing so just before an expert panel on what our industry needs to reap the benefits of AI. So I'm very excited for that panel. Just briefly about INLab. We are a joint venture between, on the one hand, Schibsted News Media, and the other, the Tinius Trust. The Tinius Trust is the major owner of Schibsted, in Schibsted, and it was founded by one of the great grandsons of Christian Schibsted, the man who founded Schibsted in the 1800s. And this team, this lab, is dedicated to exploring possible futures for current news outsiders. We do that through speculative design and iterative socio-technical prototyping. You might ask what that means, and even more so, why it matters. And to begin that story, I like to show this number. According to the Reuters News Institute, 32% of my countrymen, the Swedes, avoid the news. Frequently cited causes for this is that they feel like the news is making them feel stressed, sad, angry, or that the content isn't relevant, or that the product itself isn't relevant in its format. This is a global trend. The global average is 38%. Typically, we Scandinavians see happier numbers in our region, but when it comes to news avoidance, that really isn't the case. News avoidance, news avoiders, has become a quite popular term in research on media behaviors, and it's one that I think has rattled our industry a little bit. We are waking up to the fact that people are no longer consuming our products in the ways that we are hoping for them to do. It's a good term because it sheds light on a real issue, but I think it lacks a bit of nuance. At INLab, rather than news avoidance, we think about the problem at hand as news outsidership. We do so because we think that not consuming news is really a possible outsidership, a route to social exclusion. And we need to understand user behaviors in light of the conditions that we as media organizations provide to different groups in society, whether that's about age, gender, language skills, socioeconomic status, what have you. We think it's really important to shed light on the fact that news outsidership is a true user problem, and it's one that can have really harmful democratic consequences. What happens to a liberal democracy if parts of our populations are uninformed, if they do not have meaningful access to the third estate, or the fourth estate in English? So it's a true user problem, and it's one that we really want to meet. It's not one problem, it's not one group, it's not one particular type of user who is the news outsider. But just as AI, it's an umbrella term, a word, a phrase that covers broad terrain. But it gives you a rough idea about what we're looking at. Speaking of AI, I genuinely believe that this suite of technologies can help us meet this challenge. I believe that AI can help us build new types of media products, create new types of media content. But please note that I use the word can and not will. Because reaping the potential won't happen magically. It comes with deliberate considerations of changing user needs and changing user preferences. That requires of us as an industry to really reconsider our role in society and the ways that we operate. That means we need to think deeply and differently about the future. And if there's one domain that's good at doing that, it's definitely science fiction. As noted by one of the godfathers of the science fiction field, science fiction, or sci-fi, is the only branch of fiction that takes as its basic assumption that societies are going to change. Or, phrased differently, the future won't look like the past. That's not rocket science, but I think it's something that we as an industry really need to start thinking more deliberately about. And I found, or I keep finding, that borrowing concepts from this future-thinking domain of science fiction can be really helpful for us. We can leave aliens and all that stuff to sci-fi, but we can pick up on some of the skills when it comes to imagining possible futures for our field. One framework that we use at InLab is the Futures Cone, or the Cone of Future Possibilities. This is a very basic framework, but the idea here is that we need to start recognizing that from where we're standing today, there are so many ways that developments could go, so many possible futures. The road ahead is not linear, but there are so many different options ahead. The idea is that we need to start exploring what those possible futures are. Some of them are more expansive, more speculative than others, some more plausible. But the idea is that if you get a better sense of the options at hand, the possible futures out there, you can have a more informed discussion about which one you actually want, what direction you actually want to walk towards. Looking at AI and journalism, I think it's interesting to consider how much we've been able to kind of stretch this cone. How expansively have we been thinking about our own future? And for this, I think that the contemporary visual framing of AI in journalism is quite illustrative. Here, I'm of course referring to humanoid robots performing very traditional tasks. This New York Times illustration of robot hands going on social media through some kind of premium mechanical typewriter that has to take some kind of price. But the idea here is that we are really tying our new technological opportunities to practices and products and formats of the past. This might seem trivial, but I think it's really important to recognize how images like this, framings like this, shape our way of thinking about the tools that are now at our hands. If we see enough images of this, our minds are going to ideate in this little box that we put ourselves in. I think it shows that we have been quite constrained when it comes to thinking about what these tools can mean for us. What if it's not just about writing texts? What if it's not just about changing the ways that we produce photos? Really, this is about a very classic innovation management concept, which comes down to the idea of exploitative and explorative innovation. Meaning, should we use these tools to do more of what we already know and do that in smarter, more efficient ways? Or should we use it to radically innovate, go into unknown territory and possibly, but not certainly, possibly gain new wins? I think there's a true sense of urgency to do both of this, exploitative and explorative innovation, with the help of AI in journalism. But I think, as you all probably recognize from the past 2 days, we are definitely doing more of the first. We are exploitative in the sense of how we are using these tools. We are using it to perform traditional tasks. So I think it's really important that we start doing more of the other part, explorative innovation. And I think that doing so could help us understand the possible futures for journalism and understand the role that journalism as a function can play in the digital age. So how might we do that? How might we explore truly possible, new, different futures for journalism? as a starting point, I think we need to start engaging with people who are not invested in the ways that we have been doing things in the past. When I try to explain what we do at InLab, I usually show this lovely cartoon by Amy Wong. And I do so because I think it's about time that we start recognizing that people outside of our bubble don't necessarily look at us and the function that we play in the same way that we do. And many of them look at the world very differently than we do. And putting ourselves in the shoes of our current users, but also our possible future users, is going to be vastly important when it comes to imagining possible futures. How could we bring in new perspectives if we are anchored in the traditional past ways of doing things? One of the ways that we have done this at InLab is illustrated in the News Changemaker program. This is a program that we ran last fall. It was a 10-week professional program where we hired 10 young adults aged 16 to 19 from a socioeconomically vulnerable community in Stockholm, the outer city area of Hallonbergen. We partnered up with a youth recreation city to hire critics. We hired young people who had vocal criticism about the news media, and we brought them in for a co-creation process where the goal was to identify issues with the current offerings of news media, and most importantly, explore opportunities, explore how we could meet those issues, change where the shoe does not fit right now. This was a paid program, and it lasted for 10 weeks, always meeting at our offices in a very professional setting. And I could talk forever about this program because I truly loved this experience, and I loved the young adults that were part of this program. But for now, I'll just settle for sharing a quote that really speaks to why we needed them to work with us. After touring our offices as part of the program, one of our changemakers said that everybody here looks like their name is Karin, Karin, or Peter. And he is not wrong. My middle name is Karin, and we definitely have a lot of Peters in our building. Not to say that the names necessarily comes with a poor knack for innovation, but it says something about who we are, trying to figure out the path ahead for our industry. We truly needed these young voices to think differently and freshly about the future. They came up with 6 different speculative product ideas for the future of news, and we've posted all of them online, so you can go explore their great work on whatifthenews.com. What's safe to say is that they had a knack for innovation, and it's interesting to see how all of the futures that they ideated were largely tech-driven and, of course, AI-driven. This is not because we told them so, but because that's a natural way of thinking for these young adults. Importantly, their futures were also deeply empathic, and they put lived realities, missing perspectives, and immersive experiences really at the top. Before I wrap up, I want to show you 3 of their ideas. You've seen a lot of cases these past few days, but you get 3 more before we wrap up. The first concept that our young changemakers ideated was called the News Clinic. And the News Clinic is a speculative product that puts users' mental health front and center. So the backdrop to this idea is that our changemakers found that the news, as we know them and do them, has a severe negative effect on their mental health and ultimately on their lives. They wanted to build a service that could inform you without hurting you. In comes the News Clinic. The News Clinic has a central feature which is a news therapist. So the idea here is that you cannot consume news without a news therapist holding your hand throughout the process. This therapist is there to listen to any emotions that you might have felt during your news consumption, but also to help you make sense of the news, coaching you in how to deal with them or how to understand them. This therapist can be activated manually, you push a button, or automatically by you showing signs of physical distress. You might be holding your phone a little harder, you might be starting to sweat or increase temperature. The idea here is that the user is supported whenever the user needs support. The second idea from the changemakers is a service called It's Time. And It's Time is a news product that is ultimately designed to make people consume less news. The central feature of its time is to try to push people out of news consumption. The idea is that a user gets a weekly budget of news consumption, an amount of time that you are able to spend on news on a weekly, daily, and session-based basis. If you've reached your limit, 30 minutes in one go is the absolute limit for how much a person should ever consume news, according to the changemakers, you will be kicked out. The service will self-destruct and push you out into the real world. This service ultimately builds on an idea that the metrics of the news business is flawed. We cannot optimize for time spent and increased time spent, but we should optimize for meaningful information. If we do that, our users and our performance towards our users will be based on how well we are able to inform them in as short amount of time as possible, so that they can use that information to go out in the real world and live their lives more informed in it. Not a terrible idea, if you ask me. The third and final case that I'll share is a service that asks maybe a little bit more straightforward question, which is, what if the news was music? Here, the changemakers really go back to a very, very traditional form of storytelling, which is music. People have been telling stories and sharing information through music throughout time. It's one of the most fundamental ways we humans express ourselves. It's also one of the ways that we know that we take information to us in an effective way. We remember things through music much better than we do through reading it. So the changemakers say, why don't you take that concept to news? Why don't you take the opportunity to tap into an existing user pattern of listening to music and having music as a positive part of your day, but instead you make it informative. The idea here is that you can convert any written news stories into any type of music that you would prefer. You could have the news as a rap, you could have the news as classical music, as David showed you, or whatever style or even artist that you prefer. The news fits your preference, your behavior, rather than the other way around. The question that all of these cases asks is really, what if the news were fundamentally, truly different? What if our traditional way of delivering the news won't function in the 21st century? This is a question that a company like mine, which has been around since the 1800s, needs to take very seriously. But it's one that any media organization that wants to have a role in the 21st century media landscape, but ultimately be the function, play the function, serve the function of journalism, we need to consider this. What if our formats need to be radically different for us to serve a democratic purpose? If we open up to the opportunity, I believe that AI technologies can truly help us do this, help us make radically different, more relevant media experiences. But it's a big if, and it's if we open up. I started with a number, so I'll end with a cheesy quote. We've heard a lot about how we need systems that put human beings in charge, humans in the loop. But what does that mean? What does that require of us humans? Is it us just watching an algorithm and model? Is it us sitting in the same room as the database? I think what really is required of us as human beings in this industry is to leverage our unique human competences. And to me, that fundamentally comes down to our ability to empathize and to meaningfully see different sides to the story, understand lived realities, put other human beings and their opinions high on our agenda. And I think that what we need at this point in time is not necessarily more models or more technology, but it's humans who really shoulder the responsibilities and take the opportunity to leverage AI in ways that allows us to create an updated journalistic function. Because AI will operate in whatever boxes we put it in. So it's our job to design those boxes and hopefully make updated boxes for journalism going ahead. With that, I'll thank you for the attention and leave the room to the expert panel.